Well, thank you for that introduction. It was very nice from a fellow Floridian, so I appreciate that. And thanks very much to all of you for having me here. I had never been in Little Rock before, so this is a great opportunity, and I'm delighted to be here. This is a school of public service is really what I wanted to discuss with you, and why I want to discuss with you the public service role of the mainstream media, particularly newspapers. Many people, perhaps many of you, would not associate public service with large media corporations. Some of those companies are owned by shareholders. Their aim is to make a profit, and many of them, like the one that owns my newspaper, the New York Times Company, have long been regarded as the media elite. So where in all of that is public service? We in newspapers and mainstream media overall appear to be well out of fashion, and I would say well out of favor as well. We're often told, bluntly, gleefully, how we're the past, we're not the future. Some see us as a menace, an unnecessary intermediary with our own agenda, and an obstacle in the path of truth. And let's face it, we're unloved. Our public image is awful. Humiliatingly so. The credibility of the mainstream media has fallen to probably its lowest point since it was first measured. 60% of Americans disagree with the statement that the press tries to report the news without bias. 58% think the press does not care about complaints or inaccuracies. More than half say we're out of touch with mainstream Americans. And almost 60% think newspapers are more concerned with making profits than serving the public interest, a number that has risen over the years. A record this poor is especially troubling for a profession where credibility is central to what it is selling. If you don't believe us, if you don't trust us, it is no wonder you will look elsewhere for information. And the public is doing just that, partly because they distrust us, partly because technologically they now can, and partly because they prefer to harvest information from non-institutional sources, including their peers. I'm not going to try to address all of those issues here today, really only one, whether we in corporate media serve the public interest, whether our job and our mission is, in other words, a public service. What I intend to do this evening is to argue that the press, and particularly newspapers, on which radio, television, magazines, bloggers, and all other media rely so heavily, does serve the public interest, and that it is critical to a democracy and essential to our communities. All of that may sound like special pleading to you. I hope not. We in the press will have to figure out our own way through what has become a broken business model and also the current economic collapse. People in corporate media will never command sympathy. I don't expect it, and I don't ask for it. And let's be honest, we have many flaws. But I do hope for an honesty of another sort, an honest assessment of what is at stake as we see fewer journalists covering our communities, fewer asking questions of our government, fewer holding powerful interests accountable. And what I want to do here today is to speak from the experience of one newspaper, my newspaper, the Boston Globe. But I should say that work like the Boston Globe's occurs daily at newspapers throughout the country and everywhere in the free world. If this work disappears for lack of advertising or for lack of public support, I honestly do not know who will do it. On this scale, with constant commitment, adhering to professional standards of verification rather than the easy route of assertion, and having the same impact. So I want to tell you about the stories that we at the Boston Globe have worked on, how these stories came about, and the impact that they have had. And let me begin with one of the stories that Jonathan referenced, one of our most notable efforts, the investigation that disclosed a pervasive cover-up of sexual abuse by priests within the Roman Catholic Church. In 2001, for some months, the Boston Globe and others had been providing relatively routine coverage of a case unfolding in the state court system. It was a priest by the name of the Reverend John J. Gagan. He had been accused of molesting children. And in a routine court filing in the spring of 2001, Cardinal Bernard Law of the Archdiocese of Boston made an admission. Before he assigned Reverend Gagan to another position at another church, the cardinal acknowledged, he had received a warning that the priest had molested children, and he reassigned him anyway, without warning, it turned out, to parishioners who would be putting their children within his care. Now, that was quite an admission by the cardinal, and it caused us to embark on some more aggressive reporting. Reporters and editors of the Boston Globe decided to investigate what really happened in the Gagan case. But that would not be enough. We also decided to investigate whether the Gagan case represented a pattern within the Boston Archdiocese. Had Boston's bishops allowed other priests to remain in ministry even though they had been credibly accused of abusing minors? How many priests? How often had they been transferred from one parish to another? How many children were abused? And who in the Archdiocese was complicit? The Globe took the church to court as well. Previously, the court had sealed all the church documents in the Gagan case, and we felt that the cloak of secrecy needed to be challenged, even though we would be knocking heads with the most powerful non-government institution in Boston at the time. We filed a motion to unseal papers that would shed light on what church officials knew about molestation accusations against Reverend Gagan, when they knew about them, and how they responded. The Globe's reporting, undertaken first by a special team of investigative journalists and ultimately by an expanded team of 8 reporters, exposed arguably the biggest scandal in the history of American religion. It led to a new movement of Catholic laity, a revolt among priests against their leadership in the Boston Archdiocese, and dramatic reforms in the Catholic Church throughout the United States and even abroad. In the closing weeks of 2002, after the Globe had published 1,000 stories on this subject, Cardinal Law, once the nation's most influential Catholic prelate, resigned and begged forgiveness. The obstacles for the Globe in this investigation were, to say the least, formidable. And we had to call upon every tool possible to pry open what the Church had sought over the course of 40 years to conceal. A Globe reporter assembled a computer database that drew upon the Church's own directories of priests, allowing us to track suspicious reassignments of priests over the course of decades. The Globe examined court cases throughout the Archdiocese and conducted extensive interviews. So worried was the Boston Archdiocese about our reporting that its lawyer threatened to seek court sanctions against the Globe if it published a single confidential document or so much as interviewed a priest about clergy sex abuse. The first investigative series describing the Boston Archdiocese's handling of Reverend Gagan was published on January 6th and 7th of 2002, and the public was infuriated at what it learned. Over a period of 34 years, the Archdiocese and most recently Cardinal Law had concealed the priest's pattern of repeated sexual abuse, returning him again and again to ministry, where he would have access to children. And the story got still bigger. The Globe, succeeding in its motion to unseal documents at both the lower court and appellate level, published their contents. They revealed how the Church, while showing deep concern for the welfare of priests accused of abuse, gave dismissive treatment to victims and their families. And the papers we obtained documented how over the previous decade, the Archdiocese had secretly settled claims of sexual abuse against at least 70 priests. Months of stories by the Globe and subsequently other newspapers revealed a pattern within the Catholic Church of hiding abuse by priests and a practice of shuffling abusive priests from parish to parish. The crisis in the Church prompted an emergency meeting of American cardinals at the Vatican, and it dominated the agenda when U.S. bishops gathered for their annual conference in mid-June of 2002. At year's end, the Vatican authorized a new, far tougher policy on how American bishops would deal with clergy sex abuse. Now, for the Globe's work, we won a Pulitzer Prize for public service, but it was the gratitude of victims that means the most to us and certainly to me. I actually keep on my desk a letter from David Clossy, National Director of an organization called Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. Clossy wrote the letter to mark the 5th anniversary of our first story on this subject, so he wrote it in 2007, addressing it to the man who had led the investigation, Walter Robinson. He wrote, "As the 5-year anniversary of the series approached, several of us talked repeatedly of what we could do to show our almost overwhelming gratitude to you and your colleagues. No gesture seemed even close to being adequate. We still feel that way. You have made literally tens of thousands of children safer while helping literally thousands of deeply wounded adults feel some comfort and vindication. At the same time, you have caused countless decision makers to rethink what their organization does to prevent and detect abuse and how better to respond when abuse happens." Now, perhaps someone else might have done what the Boston Globe did. Perhaps others might have devoted 18 months of their time, more than $1 million in salaries, and tens of thousands of dollars in legal costs to this subject. Perhaps someone else might have confronted one of the world's most powerful institutions. Perhaps someone else would have had the stamina and ultimately the impact of the Globe. But here's what I know. A newspaper did this. And here's what I suspect. No one else would have. And the abuse and the cover-up would have continued. Now let me shift to the political arena, and this time the work of a single reporter working alone with his editor. The reporter is now at the New York Times, but this work took place while he was at the Boston Globe in our Washington bureau. His name is Charlie Savage. His editor was Peter Canellis, our Washington bureau chief. Now, we're all familiar with the Rose Garden signing ceremony. A bill goes through Congress, then members of Congress surround the president. He puts his signature on the bill. Photographs are taken of the very happy occasion. Now, in the Bush administration, Savage disclosed, these events were a charade. The signing ceremony was followed by another ritual, away from the photographers, away from the senators and congressmen. The White House issued a presidential signing statement telling government officials which of those laws that were just signed the president can ignore. This assertion of executive authority, of a right to approve laws but then defy them, had been central to the administration's efforts to expand the power of the presidency. Few knew it was happening. Charlie Savage exposed it in 2006. Savage first disclosed that Bush, even though he had signed a law banning torture amid much fanfare, had later reserved the right to ignore that law. He then went on to disclose that Bush had claimed a right to bypass carefully negotiated new safeguards in the Patriot Act. Over time, Savage reviewed every Bush signing statement, and he came to a startling conclusion. The president had claimed authority to ignore 750 laws. Now, signing statements weren't new. Other administrations had used them, including the Clinton administration, but no one had deployed them as often as Bush, who reserved the authority to challenge more laws than all previous presidents combined. Republicans and Democrats were incensed at the president's defiance of the will of Congress and the secret subversion of laws he himself signed. The American Bar Association assembled a task force of legal scholars in reaction to Charlie's work. Retired judges and former officials of both parties to study signing statements. And prompted by that task force's report, the ABA called for presidents to stop using the device because it was, quote, contrary to the rule of law and our constitutional separation of powers. And in the Washington Times, Nat Hantoff wrote that public attention to these unilateral disruptions of our rule of law had begun with the extraordinarily diligent research by one reporter, Charlie Savage of the Boston Globe, evidence that a lone journalist can rise above the quicksand of the 24-hour news cycle and make a significant difference. I call Charlie Savage's work and that of his editor a public service. The sort of digging that our investigative team did with abusive priests, or Charlie Savage did with signing statements, occurs routinely at the local level at newspapers around the country. Who else really digs into what is happening at the local school board? Who else is willing to keep watch over the state's legislatures or its representatives in Congress? Who else really challenges powerful interests of every sort? Business, bureaucrats, politicians, unions, police, or even prosecutors and the courts who are supposed to keep watch over everyone else. In recent years, the Los Angeles Times has exposed shockingly bad medical care at a major public hospital. The Birmingham News in Alabama exposed corruption and cronyism in the state's two-year college system. The Willamette Week in Portland, Oregon, revealed a former governor's long-concealed relationship with a 14-year-old girl. The Miami Herald's investigations of malfeasance at its local housing agency led to criminal charges. The San Diego Union Tribune and Copley News Service disclosed that Congressman Randy Cunningham was taking bribes, a public betrayal that would land him in prison. So let me tell you another story from Boston. Last year in South Boston, a 14-year-old girl named Asiya Johnson and her 3-year-old sister were killed in an early morning fire. Their mother and family dog were safely out of their home, a row house, but the girls were trapped on the 3rd floor. They were urged to jump to save themselves. They didn't jump, and they perished in a fire that was believed to be arson. These tragedies make the evening news. People who watch say, what a shame, how sad. But journalists say, what really happened here and why? And then they do the hard work to find out. Troubling details emerged from the deaths of 14-year-old Asiya Johnson and her 3-year-old sister. The mother was a drug addict with a long criminal record. Asiya's father was in jail. Asiya, according to those who knew her, had defied the circumstances of her birth and her dysfunctional family life. She was a talented basketball player, a mother figure to her little sister, an honor roll student who was trying to study her way out of poverty. By state order, she was not supposed to be living in the house where she died. 2 of our reporters sought to answer the lingering questions: how did so many fail Asiya? How did her family fail her, her neighbors, her school, the government? The reporters went to the county prison and met with Asiya's father. They interviewed other relatives. They went to the community center, the schools, courthouses in Massachusetts and Florida, and the offices of state agencies that were supposed to be monitoring and helping Asiya, but failed. This was a story of neglect at every stage, along every path, and it was a story that our reporters told in a 7,500-word narrative. The story elicited sympathy, plenty of it, but fortunately, there was more than that. There was action. The Child Welfare Agency instituted reforms that would affect the placement and monitoring of about 500 children a year. Shortly, the governor asked the state's child advocate to launch an investigation. The advocate issued a report in December describing fundamental failures by the state and calling for better training for social workers, improved information sharing with law enforcement, and more comprehensive documentation of neglect and abuse. And the governor pledged to follow through. And we will watch to see that he follows through, because the neglect that led to Asiya Johnson's death cannot continue after it, and because that is our job as a newspaper. So here's what troubles me. People care about what happened to Asiya Johnson, as they should. But so many take for granted the reporting that exposed the systemic failures that led to her death. People care about the abuse of authority by the president, but so many take for granted the reporting that brought this abuse to light. People care about the abuse by priests that brought lifelong suffering to so many children. They care that abusive priests were allowed to molest again and again. They care that one of the world's great religious institutions covered up that abuse for years to escape the taint of scandal. But so many take for granted the reporting that exposed that cover-up and put a stop to it. A recent op-ed in the New York Times recalled the words that Thomas Jefferson famously penned in 1787. Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate to prefer the latter. And the authors added correctly, today we are dangerously close to having a government without newspapers. So here's an interesting trend for you. In developing countries, newspaper circulation is rising, and rising sharply. Sales in Brazil increased 12% last year. In India, circulation was up 11%. And then you see the same remarkable trends in Pakistan and much of Asia and Latin America. As incomes in these countries and regions rise, as they feel more invested in their own societies, and as literacy improves, they see the value in reading, and they see value in a vibrant press, and they conclude that it is worth a small piece of their hard-earned income. Now, here in the United States, newspaper circulation is shrinking, even though the readership of our journalism, if you count those drawn to it on the internet, is at record highs. But information is free on the web, for the most part. People expect it to be free. And in the process, the work of the press has become devalued, and it is far too often taken for granted. I'm not suggesting that the mainstream press is entitled to its previous prosperity, although it would be nice. It is not entitled to power and influence. Ours may be the only industry that cannot and should not run with cupped hands to the government seeking charity and a bailout. We will depend in the future, as we have in the past, as we do today, entirely on the public. But in deciding whether to make us or break us, the public needs to make its choice with eyes open to what will go missing. If the press is not here, chances are high that a lot will go missing. Today, many local news organizations have stopped covering their representatives and senators in Washington. They barely cover legislators in the state capitol, or the courts, municipal government, local arts institutions, local schools. Imperfect coverage of the past has, sadly, become worse. Defective, deficient, even disappeared. Bill Keller, the editor of the New York Times, put it well, I think, recently in an online exchange with readers. He said, "There is a diminishing supply of quality journalism and a growing demand." And then he continued, "By quality journalism, I mean the kind that involves experienced reporters going places, bearing witness, digging into records, developing sources, checking and double-checking, backed by editors who try to enforce high standards. I mean journalism that, however imperfect, labors hard to be trustworthy, to supply you with the information you need to be an engaged citizen. The supply of this kind of journalism is declining," Bill said, "because it is hard, expensive, sometimes dangerous work." So what will get covered and what will not? The horrible inferno that took the life of young Asiya Johnson will be covered, of course. You only need a camera to record a fire, and everyone has one with a cell phone. But it is unlikely that someone will spend the time and the resources, or have the access and the know-how to unearth the tragic institutional failures that allowed Asia's life to be cut short. When the president signs a bill, that will be recorded, of course. But if he secretly subverts the laws in the bill he just signed, that may well go unnoticed or at least little publicized. And if there is a conspiracy of silence by powerful people that allows children to be abused, there will be no independent force to prevent that from continuing. We don't have time here today to explore the collapse of the economic model that now imperils a vigorous and independent mainstream press, or to explore whether new entrepreneurial ventures, nonprofit and profit-making, can emerge with sufficient strength to fill the gap left by a weakened, diminished, or even vanquished old media guard. Still, we have time, and I think now is the moment to stop taking the work of the press for granted. That is one small step, but it is a most important first step in assuring that we have a strong, independent press of some sort in our future. Thank you very much.
Questions about the press? Sir, we got one right over here, Bob, behind you.
You talked about the increasing readership in developing nations. Is there any way to say how many of those nations have some semblance of press freedom versus how many of those people are simply picking up state-run media papers?
Well, I think I haven't done the studies, but what I think the evidence shows is that where there is more freedom of expression, where there is a stronger independent press, the local population is eating it up. And there are some countries, you take Mexico, for example, which I'm quite familiar with, some of the papers that used to be not necessarily officially state-run, but were effectively state-run, they actually have seen their future in distancing themselves from government because independent newspapers arose. So, for example, in Mexico would be La Reforma, and so other newspapers that were much closer to the government, like El Universal, decided to be more independent, and people are consuming that and eating it up.
How you doing? I'm Nicholas Hall, Clinton School student. My question is about the statement I hear a lot, I don't read the paper because of all the bad news. So I'm wondering, what is your personal system for deciding of covering, say, a rapist on page 1 or a food bank on page 1? What is the decisions that go into that?
Well, it's hard. Every day is different. So I was saying earlier, and with an interview with Chad, that I don't really know what we're going to be doing day to day because our product is different than every other business's product because it changes. It's unpredictable. And what I think I'm doing in the morning, I may not be doing in the afternoon. So it's hard to predict what the front page of the newspaper is going to be every day. It kind of depends on what happens. That said, we do a fair amount of planning to prepare for the slow news days, if not to prepare for sort of a coherent news package. So we try to have a mix, actually, is what we try to do. When particularly these days, when the news has been pretty depressing because of the economy, we make a regular effort to put stories on the front page that are different, that may be entertaining, that may be inspirational, that may be just good news. They still have to be news. They can't be the ordinary life, because ordinary life doesn't qualify as news. But we had a story the other day, just by way of example. It was the most extraordinary thing. One of our reporters was at a community event, just covering it, and she was approached by a woman, and she said, I'd like your help. And she said, well, how can I help you? And she said, when I was a child, a baby, I was rescued from a home by a firefighter, and it's been 40 years. And I've never been able to find him, and I've never been able to thank him. But ever since 9/11, I felt that it was my duty to do so. So she said, can you help me find him? So our reporter went and she found him. He lives in South Boston. And we arranged the reunion. And we wrote about that reunion. And we gave it a huge display on the front page of the paper, pictures of then and now, the firefighter holding the baby and trying to breathe life into her, and then today when they were together. And we did a video as well, since we're multimedia these days. So we had a video of it. We put it up on our website. The response has been unbelievable. We do about, on a normal day, we do about 1 million unique visitors to our website a day. It's extraordinary. But that day, we did 2.5 million unique visitors to our website. There were 1.5 million plays of the video alone, and it got attention all over the country. CNN called us asking if they could use the video. They ultimately decided not to do something, but too much depressing news, I assume. But the local CBS affiliate, we were in the position of providing, believe it or not, a newspaper was in the position of providing video to the local television station. I thought I'd never see this day, and day after day, it still gets plays. I mean, people just love this story. My younger brother lives in Atlanta, in Sandy Springs, and his neighbor is basically a press hater. He hates the press, and he's very conservative, and he thinks that the shopper that is dropped on his driveway every day is about the best it gets. But he sent my brother a note saying, this thing ran in your brother's paper. Tell him to keep up the good work, So we try. We try.
Got a question over here.
How are you today, sir? Thank you for joining us. My name is Demas Espinola. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. You've touched on it at different points throughout your speech, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on how newspapers as businesses are going to evolve with the advent of the internet as major news resources now.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have all the answers just yet. We are working on it. The general view was that with the advent of the internet, which is not a new story anymore, that we would migrate to the internet, that we would provide things free on the internet because everything seemed to be free on the internet, and that's how people expected to receive them, and that we would make our money from advertising that would shift over to the internet. Unfortunately, that's proving not to be a terribly good model, or not a sufficient model. We make money on the internet, but it's not enough money to pay for the kind of reporting that I was just talking about. So for every dollar that we used to earn in a print product in the newspaper, we earn roughly 10 cents for an ad. So that 90% decline in income is not a good thing for our future. At the same time, huge categories of advertising are simply disappearing from newspapers and probably from newspaper websites. So general classifieds, so where to get furniture, find an apartment, things like that. You have Craigslist now. So cars. You have cars.com, you have other car sites, you have Craigslist. Jobs, many of them shifted over to monster.com or hot jobs or things like that. They're actually now shifting to Craigslist. So you get the drift. Craigslist is free for the most part, and it's very hard to compete with free. You can't offer a better price. So this is the conundrum that we face. So where are we headed? We're all now struggling to figure that out. Do we charge something for our content on the web? It's easier said than done. And there's a huge debate now in the field about whether that's the way to go. And we will see. We'll see where that ends up. It's not clear yet, not clear at all, that we can make more money from people paying a fee than we can make from the advertising that appears online. We'll have to see, and I'm sure people will test different models. The Wall Street Journal, for example, has a hybrid model where you pay for certain content and don't pay for other content. The New York Times at one time had a requirement, they implemented a requirement that if you wanted to read their columnists like Tom Friedman and Gail Collins and Maureen Dowd or whoever, you would have to pay a fee to read them. And they made money from that. But they concluded later that it's stifled their growth and that there was more money to be made from advertising than there was from people paying a fee. But that debate has been renewed now that the crisis in American newspapers has gotten so much worse, and we'll see where it ends up. So, if I didn't offer you a clear explanation of how we're going to make money in the future, that speaks to the lack of clarity in the industry these days about how we're going to make money in the future. I'm not sure that anybody truly knows.
Further questions?
Talking about payments, I think one of the issues that's come up recently is micropayments, where you would pay something like 10 cents for an article or a small amount for one article rather than for an entire broadsheet. What's your opinion of that, and what do you think of the viability of that?
Well, unfortunately, the MBA that I earned a long time ago hasn't prepared me for this, to figure it all out. There's a suggestion that we should be like iTunes. So every time somebody comes, they pay a little bit of money. So it's 5 cents or something like that for each story. And there's a huge debate. I haven't seen any evidence that that will work. There are some people who think that it will. So, for example, Walter Isaacson wrote a piece on the cover of Time magazine about that. I guess Walter's got all the answers, but I'm not sure he does. So people have since pointed out, like Michael Kinsley of Slate, the founder of Slate, pointed out that they used to charge for Slate, and when they charged for Slate, it was a disaster. It was only when they made it free that it became successful. And he also points out, and others have pointed out, that paying for a piece of music is different than paying for a piece of journalism. Journalism is inherently perishable. So after you've read it, you have no further need for it unless you're doing some research project. As opposed to music, which if you paid 99 cents for it because of iTunes, you can listen to it over and over and over again, and you do. And so it has long-term durable value. So the idea of applying the iTunes model to the newspaper model, maybe it'll work, but it's not at all clear that it will.
Vicki?
When I read the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, the print versions, I'm struck more and more by more and more proofreading errors. And I know these are not your publication, but I realize proofreading errors aren't exactly the crime of the century, but it makes you wonder about, well, they're not paying attention to this. What else aren't they paying attention to in terms of checking their facts and everything? So I wonder if you have any insight into that.
Right. Well, when I studied journalism, we used to say that if you couldn't get the little things right, how can you get the big things right? The problem now is, and so it's true, there are more proofreading errors, and there are more typos and what have you. The reason for that is just a reduction in overall staff, and then when you're making those reductions in staff, you say, well, what are we going to give up? Are we going to give up reporters who are out in the field actually gathering information and writing stories? Or can we give up some portion, not all, but some portion of the people who are involved in copy editing? And more and more newspapers have decided to give up some of the copy editing resources. At the Wall Street Journal, when it was acquired by Rupert Murdoch and News Corporation, one of the first decisions that they made, and there are people who like what they've done or other people who don't like what they've done with the paper, and I won't, that's people's personal opinion there. But one of the things that they did is they actually reduced the overall number of copy editors, the overall number of editors, too, just generally. At the New York Times, I don't know what the numbers are. I know that our own newspaper, it is increasingly difficult to do as much as we're doing in print and on the web during the course of the day with the number of people that we have. And so more mistakes are made, and that's unfortunate. But what we find ourselves in these days is that, people who went into newspapers, they used to go into newspapers because they didn't want to go into television, they didn't want to go into radio, they didn't want to work for a wire service, turning out stories 5 times a day. They wanted to do what a newspaper did, spend time on stories, work it, make it read as well as possible. Now, here's what the life is like in a newspaper. Now we're a wire service because we're on the web and we have to produce stories all during the course of the day. People read this stuff during the day, sometimes while they're supposed to be working, and we appreciate that. Sometimes they say our business model is based on people goofing off at work, which is fine. So we have to produce stories during the course of the day, We have to produce the videos that I was just talking about. We produce audio, so we're doing videos, which is what television does. We produce audio like radio does. And then at the end, we're supposed to, for the next day, produce a high-quality newspaper that is qualitatively different and maybe even qualitatively better than what we've been doing all during the day. And we have to do that all with significantly less staff than we had in the past. That's a huge challenge, and I wish I had an answer for it, but that's the challenge that we're under today.
Question right here, Samantha.
Going back to the concept of charging for online readership, I'm just curious if it ever comes into play in your conversations, the idea that, you know, the internet was sort of designed to be free and accessible to everyone and equal. So how does that come in when you're deciding, are we going to charge or are we not?
Right. I saw a quote recently from Eric Schmidt of Google, the head of Google. He said he dismissed the notion of charging for journalism on the internet. And he said, information wants to be free. Until then, I didn't know that information wanted anything. But now I know. It's true. The culture of the internet is free. And people are not coming to your website necessarily through the front door, which is, for us, going to boston.com or going to nytimes.com or something like that. They're coming in through the back door or the side door or the basement door, whatever it is, through a search engine. Or an RSS feed, or a widget on Facebook, or whatever it might be. So they are not necessarily loyalists of your brand. In fact, less and less are they loyalists of a particular brand. When you ask many people, particularly younger people these days, where do you get your information, including knowledgeable people, they have a hard time telling you where they got it. They just kind of got it somewhere. And so in that environment, it's very difficult to start charging. What can you charge for? Well, you probably can charge for some things that the Wall Street Journal charges for, which is business-oriented information that has a seemingly concrete monetary value. So somebody might be willing to pay for that. You can charge, ESPN.com charges for certain kinds of things. I think, I don't use it for this, but people who play fantasy, who are into fantasy baseball, for example, they charge for information related to fantasy baseball. So if you have a deep, deep passion about something, then you may be willing to pay for access to that. So people are looking at that. Is there some sort of hybrid model where some things can be free and some things can be charged? And charge in particular for things that have a identifiable monetary value or appeal to a deep passion that people might have.
Got time for one more question, Dan.
Hi, my name's Dan Shea. I was wondering, sort of in the same vein that you were just talking about, how the role of editors has changed in the digital age when people can personalize their news to the extent that they don't have to flip through the paper and maybe find articles that they wouldn't have otherwise clicked on online. How has that changed the role of editors in this age?
Well, it's a good question. I think that because the role will change. One way that it's changed that doesn't quite address your point is that editors are now not just assigning stories and photographs and graphics, they're assigning video as well. So that's a big difference for somebody who's only worked in newspapers in the past. But people want to be their own editors. They don't want me deciding what kind of information they get. They want to decide for themselves. And I understand that. We had, at the Globe, a few weeks back, we invited a bunch of digerati in Boston to come join us for dinner and give us their thoughts on our website and what we might do to make things better and maybe make some money. So the first thing they said is, forget about website, because people aren't necessarily coming to your website. They're coming to your story from somewhere else. And the other thing that was pointed out was that one of the people there said, people want to be their own editors. They don't want you to be their editor. And I said, I know that already. I said, what we do, though, is, and they're all proposing aggregation models, so we just take everybody else's stuff and aggregate it, which is what Google does. They're the ultimate aggregator. They don't produce any news. They just aggregate. When people say, I get my news from Google News, well, Google News doesn't actually write any news. So So they proposed a lot of aggregation models and said people want to be their own editor, and they gave us a lot of good advice. But I said, well, I understand that. I said, but here's what we do. We actually go out, gather information, try to verify it, put it in context, write it in a coherent way, ideally write it in an engaging way, and then distribute that information. I said, what is the business model for that as opposed to aggregation? And the guy I asked the question of, he sat back and he said, looks at me and goes, I don't know. So that's where we are in this industry. And as far as the role of editors, I think we have to realize where do people get information. And we're still working stories. We're trying to think of the different ways that people may get into a story. They may get into a video. They may get into an audio. They may come through to read the story itself. They may come in for supplemental material. So we're thinking much more broadly about how people access information these days, how they might arrive at our information these days. But we're still trying to pay attention to the basics, the core values of making sure that what we write or what we produce in video or what we produce in audio has been verified, is in proper context, and makes sense, and ideally is engaging. So that part of the job hasn't changed much.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Marty.